Hello.
For those that are just joining, please don't forget to rename so we could see your names.
I'm loading up your slides right here in a second, Alan. I'm just recording and getting you set up as co-host. So,
super. Thank you. So just so we're all aware, the session is being recorded, and we'll take it that you all consent to the recording. Great. Brenda, do you mind renaming your... So as Tom sets up the slides, our session is about 20 to 30 minutes. And it will be mostly a discussion. First, I'll give a bit of context in addition to what Brenda shared about the Kampala research. And then thereafter, we'll go into some questions that will guide our discussions on how what can be done to scale up pit emptying services, both from a private and a public sector point of view. I think we are ready. We can get started. Tom, next slide, please. Super. So for just to introduce Kampala, it's a city by the shores of Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is one of the biggest freshwater lakes in the world. The city is rather small, so it's about 200 kilometers squared in terms of the surface area. But houses a population of about 3 million during the day, and roughly half that reside overnight within the city. The big takeaway, though, is that over 60% of the residents live in informal settlements. So that pictured to the bottom right is a typical of where you'll find the majority of people living in Kampala. Next, please. So when it comes to containment, if we are looking at the value chain, overall, there's quite good access to sanitation. So over 99% who are accessing a sanitation facility, with only 1% that are practicing open defecation. But when we go down into the details, let's see. We ask you to mute. Joining. Thank you. So in terms of the details, only roughly about 8% of the city is sewered. So the rest of the city is served by on-site sanitation, which means there's a huge market for emptying and transportation services there. And I'll immediately flag up one of the challenges to that is that only 30% of those households accesses improved sanitation. And when it comes to toilets that are serviceable, we see that roughly about 40% of the toilets in the city cannot be emptied for various reasons. The majority being that they're traditionally constructed, which means the pit that would collapse during the process. And that maybe I'll conclude there by saying that household containment is mainly a responsibility for households. So as we were talking, as we heard from the previous presentations, affordability then becomes an issue. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the emptying and transportation sector or subsector, the Kampala is pursuing a regulated private sector model. So this is where the city authorities and the other regulators oversee the services of the private sector. We'll add that we have a very vibrant private sector. The last count, it was about 137 vacuum trucks and about 23, I believe there are even more gulpers. Brenda will update us on that. And in terms of the market, the majority of the market is captured by the cesspool trucks, which doesn't then match with the 60% informal settlements, because as you know, informal settlements have accessibility issues. So I think this is telling us that there's a huge potential for the gulpers, but it also may be telling us that not all the sludge is being collected from the city. In terms of the emptying fees, these are based on trips for the cesspool, for the vacuum trucks, and on the volume emptied for the gulpers or the manual emptiers. Overall, we believe that the collection efficiency of sludge, fecal sludge collected in the city is about 61%, and taken to the treatment plants. With the treatment plants, we have one wastewater plant and another co-treatment facility that combines both wastewater and fecal sludge treatment. There are plans in the pipeline for more plants so that we could have sufficient emptying capacity. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges, I think we kind of highlighted these during the polls. So availability and affordability, not only of the emptying services, but also the containment structures. That is one of the biggest. Although we're pursuing a regulated private sector model, not all of the emptiers have formalized and joined and licensed. So there's still some work to be done there. And I think I'll skip to the financing, the affordable financing, linked to the first challenge for both the emptiers and the households. Next, please. So that was a bit of additional context with regards to Kampala, and now is the discussion session where I'll be helped by Brenda and Tom to go through these 3 questions for the private sector, and then we also have another 3 questions to go through within the next 10 minutes. So I'll now open up the discussion by asking that very first question. What do we believe the objectives of the private sector to be? The floor is open. Thank you. Any takers? Okay. Brenda, sorry to put you on the spot. Or we could start off by excellent. I guess what we could say is we could yes, have them on the chat. So to make money, that is, I think that's straightforward. That's the biggest driver for the private sector. And then to help government deliver on their commitments. I think that's very interesting because there's a huge conversation going on about the emptying services being recognized as a public service, public sector service, and that the private sector helping to deliver that. So that's also spot on. Any other comments? Just to drop them on there. Yes, absolutely. So I think we have, Andres, you're answering the 3rd question, which is good. How can they be supported? So subsidies or incentives could be a very good way to do that. Capacity to provide the service, yes, that's a barrier. And one that we're seeing currently in Kampala, we only have about 50% capacity in terms of the sludge being generated. Creating the linkage between the service and communities, absolutely. at the end of the day, the communities only want a service. So how it's delivered is the next step on the line, and creating that linkage is very important. To be respected as sanitation professionals, oh yes, we've seen this happening quite a lot. We've seen this happening the last couple of 8 years of hand-holding the MTers, and one of their key, if you like, takeaways or proud moments is that they're now recognized as professionals. Private sector's role is to, thank you, Rachel, to develop innovative solutions to sanitation issues. Is spot on as well. I think we're seeing that happening now with a number of versions of the manual emptying equipment. Safe disposal, I think that is one of the barriers, especially in Kampala. We've had the challenge of the treatment plants not having adequate facilities that can be used by the manual emptiers. So that's a very big point down to the safe disposal. Tom, I wish just to guide me when we hit the 5-minute mark, and we can move on to the public sector as well. Oh, rather the public sector, good. So John Allen, you can't remember the presentation, but yes, so we've seen lots of spin-offs, and Kampala in the presentation had a very high spin-off rate of 43%. So you're right. It's a very good indicator of the healthy private sector that sees a profit. And if some of these barriers are then eliminated or removed or reduced, we actually can see a lot more happening there. Super. So I think now we had quite a good feedback with regards to the private sector. I request that we now also comment on the public sector. So what's the role of the public sector in this case, in scaling up emptying businesses? And again, we start with a very similar question. What are the objectives of the private sector? Does the private sector have for increasing safe coverage? And whether this can apply citywide or would need proper interventions. So one barrier we're seeing in the public sector is around government willingness to provide a service or support the private sector. Okay. It's an interesting one. And a valid one as well, because it's dependent on a lot of the time on the technical and the human resource capacities that the public sector has. Yes, I think subsidies have a big role to play in scaling up or making businesses attractive, especially to the poorest. The key question there would, however, be how sustainable the subsidies can be. So how to do it sustainably would be a very good solution. Rachel, again, support citizens access human rights. Yes, I think it's in our constitution nationally, it's in all our public health legal frameworks that role and that objective should be met. Enforcement, yes. What are the options that the public sector have? I think enforcement is the biggest and one of the biggest things that it can do. Rules to regulate, absolutely. And for many times, it's also quite interesting for the public sector to understand and then later on implement the regulatory roles. Ensure quality services, yes. So should have some feedback mechanisms, and Brenda talked about the call center and how it comes in to try and offer that to the residents. Another barrier, lack of conducive growth for businesses. Yes, we're saying transport costs are quite high, and it's because the disposal points are far in between. So that would be a very good point. Safe access, yes, I believe you mentioned that. That's good. Incentivize and enforce regulations. Yes, I'll be interested to hear later on how the ideas around the incentivizing not only the private sector but also the public sector, so that they can actually go on and do their work. Yes, corruption comes in, and that definitely is a barrier that needs to be checked. Ooh, academia, that's a good point. So I think in terms of the opportunities that are available to the public sector, academia is one of them, to really get the data out on how the services can be provided. So Andres, you're saying that rather than subsidies, it could be framed as payments. Okay, yes, so we could twist the models such that rather than a subsidy, it's actually a payment for a service provided. I think that is one opportunity for sure. And so, Tom, yes, I think I can mention something small we're doing with the subsidies. So we realize that with the market as is, it tends to cherry pick, and the work tends to go to the wealthier parts of the city rather than the poorer parts of the city. So KCC is now rolling out a few targeted subsidies that are really looking at the poorer sections of the city and ensuring that these also get these services. And what was interesting, that it was timely, that these subsidies started running during the COVID period, where incomes were further strained. So these subsidies have been very much welcomed. And every other time, the residents keep asking for more of that subsidy. But the other positive spin-off of that was that the pit emptiers also got at least their businesses running. So they were able to at least generate income during a very trying moment when many other businesses were closing. So it was a win-win for both the private sector and for the communities. We're still trying to identify what the right price point for that subsidy or payment should be. So there's still a bit of work that is going on to try and empirically identify what that right subsidy should be or how it should be structured better. So this research will be very instrumental in trying to feed into that as well. Super. Proper coverage is not different, but is or should be part of the role of the public sector. So as you mentioned, Yvonne, if you take it that the services provided citywide, you actually find that without any deliberate interventions or intentions on the part of the city to target those poorest communities, you find they get left out. So I think the key message here is that as we're rolling out services, we should also be intentional that they reach these poorer communities. Tom, so you're asking about the area-wide service contracts. Yes. So at the minute, we have area-wide service contracts. They are not tiered in their pricing because they are, for the moment, targeting only the poorer communities. But the view is that with time, and in the near future, we'll be able to have a tariff or a price for the service that can cross-subsidize the poorer communities in the city. So at the minute, it's not tiered. It's only, what we're saying though is that through the whole process of competitively competitively selecting these MTS, but the price has also come down. So that's already a positive movement on the side of affordability. What we now want to do is couple it out with a cross-subsidy model to cover the wealthier parts of the city. And do I think the subsidies distort the market? That's a very good question, because what we are seeing is that the extra business generated out of the subsidies. So for instance, if an MTR goes into a community and is emptying, say, my latrine, and my neighbor gets interested and comes over, usually the negotiation with the neighbor will not tend to come to the same price that I'll be paying under the subsidy. So I think in a way you're right that it's kind of I wouldn't say distorting the market, but it's giving options to say, look, that's for a subsidy under the PROPOA intervention, but maybe add a bit extra to make the whole business more viable. So that is something we're still studying though, and it is something that we need to correct. But I agree with you that it's actually helping us structure the market better, and in that also driving the market growth. So there's a warning here that we have about 2 minutes to go back to the plenary. Any other comments, Rachel? So is there a way for the city to offer content dumping sites throughout the city? Yes, so this is one of the options that is on the table, and we have been in a few discussions with a few partners over this, and we're waiting to see how actually this would translate into extending the coverage of these services across the city. But it's definitely one of those options. But even with the containerized system, you'd still need the wastewater treatment plants. So this is still an opportunity that would need to come in. Absolutely, Ruthie. It would be a pleasure. It would be a pleasure to have that, share that experience. Yep, it would be great to share. I believe by next year's conference we'll have quite a bit of data on the subsidy, and we'll be able to share that as well. Super. Thank you, everyone. I believe we can now switch to the plenary session.
So you'll have to leave this call and then go back to that page and then join again on the plenary. So see you all there. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Tom. Let's all close this, leave this chat and move to the next one. Thank you.